So after looking through the newest update coming to Path of Exile 2 in patch 0.5, I honestly think this update reveals something much more interesting about Grindinggeargames' long-term plans for PoE 2. Because the more you look at the changes, the less this feels like a normal content patch, and the more it feels like GGG trying to fundamentally change how players interact with Path of Exile's endgame altogether. And weirdly enough, I don't think the biggest change is actually in the endgame or the bosses or the Atlas overall, or even the league itself. It's much more about how this update is designed to reduce friction, because Path of Exile 2 is approaching a really important moment right now. On May 29th, Grindinggeargames is releasing patch 0.5, Return of the Ancients, and honestly, this doesn't feel like just any normal update anymore. It feels like the point where PoE 2 starts transitioning from promising early access ARPG into whatever the full long-term version of the game is actually supposed to become before patch 1.0 later this year. And that becomes much clearer once you start looking into what this patch is actually focused on, because this is by far the biggest update PoE 2 has received during its early access. The patch notes themselves were released on May 21st, a little over a week before launch, which is unusually early for Grindinggeargames. And that alone kind of signals how important this update is internally. This isn't just balance tweaks or a few new bosses. This is a complete overhaul of the endgame. And that's important because if there's one thing people have consistently criticized about PoE 2 so far, it's not really the combat or the visuals, it's more of the combat structure. Because right now PoE 2 has this strange split in identity. The campaign experience is generally very well received. People love the atmosphere, the combat feel, the slower pacing compared to PoE 1, and the more deliberate gameplay. The base game itself is already feeling extremely strong mechanically. The classes, the skill system, moment-to-moment combat, most players actually seem pretty happy with those aspects already. But once players actually reach the end game, the sentiment changes quite a bit. A lot of people felt like the game suddenly became much more directionless. You had systems layered on top of systems, mechanics that didn't really align together properly, and progression that could sometimes feel more confusing than rewarding. And patch 0.5 seems very specifically designed to address this. The biggest part of the update is the new Infinite Atlas overhaul. Now, instead of the Atlas feeling random or fragmented, it introduces fixed points of interest, meaning you actually know where certain mechanics and systems are located. And it might sound like a small change, but for Path of Exile, that's actually pretty huge, because one of the long-standing issues PoE has had has been with the friction through obscurity. Sometimes the game doesn't challenge you because the mechanics are difficult. It challenges you because you don't know where anything is, what content leads into other content, or how systems connect together long term. And the new Atlas seems specifically designed to reduce that kind of friction. Now, instead of endlessly wandering through maps hoping to randomly encounter mechanics you need, the Atlas is becoming much more readable structurally speaking. You'll be able to identify fixed regions tied to specific mechanics and progression paths. But what's really interesting is how dynamic the Atlas itself is now seemingly becoming. Different areas of the Atlas can apparently develop unique effects and conditions depending on where you choose to engage and what mechanics spread through those regions over time. One example is the Delirium Fog, now spreading dynamically across sections of the Atlas map, enhancing enemies and changing the difficulty and reward structure of nearby maps. And that's actually a pretty interesting evolution of the Atlas system philosophically, because the Atlas no longer just feels like a menu of disconnected maps. It starts feeling more like an evolving world state. Your progression, your choices, and the mechanics you engage with actively begin shaping the structure of the endgame itself. And honestly, that changes the psychology of the grind quite a bit, because progression starts feeling less random and more goal-oriented. You're no longer just farming maps hoping the game gives you something useful. You're planning routes, you're targeting systems, you're making decisions based on long-term progression rather than just pure chance. And that same philosophy shows up across the rest of the update too. There are now 5 entirely new endgame storylines and quest lines, which Grindinggeargames says adds over 50 hours of new content. But more importantly, these systems now seem much more integrated into the Atlas itself. All the mechanics like Breach and Ritual aren't just returning, they're being reworked in a more complete progression arc with dedicated quest lines, rewards, and encounters attached to them. So instead of old League mechanics feeling like disconnected leftovers from PoE 1, they now seem to function as actual pillars of the endgame structure. And honestly, I think that's one of the more important long-term changes here, because PoE has historically had this tendency to accumulate systems over time without always fully integrating them together, which eventually creates what some people might call content bloat, where the game technically has enormous amount of content, but not all of it feels equally meaningful or connected. And patch 0.5 feels like Grindinggeargames trying to consolidate that complexity into something more cohesive. There's also a completely new Atlas passive tree with somewhere between 300 and 400 nodes, which honestly sounds insane, but also very Path of Exile-like at the very same time, because Grindinggeargames has always leaned into player agency and build specialization. But what's really interesting here is that the Atlas tree itself now seems less focused on raw quantity and more on shaping the type of endgame experience you actually want, whether you prefer bossing, specific league mechanics, targeted farming, progression spread, crafting efficiency, or risk reward scaling. The Atlas increasingly feels less like a static endgame system and much more like something players actively customize around their own playstyle. And honestly, the crafting side of the update plays into that too, because a lot of the systems, especially Runes of Aldura, seems like it's designed around giving players more deterministic progression and better long-term item planning instead of purely gambling outcomes endlessly. That doesn't mean Path of Exile suddenly stops being RNG heavy, but it does seem like Grindinggeargames is trying to make progression feel a lot more intentional. And honestly, one of the most important additions might not even be the bosses or the Atlas changes. It might actually be the in-game build planner, because for years one of the weirdest thing about Path of Exile has been that a huge part of the actual game existed outside of the game. Path of building, build guides, third-party websites, spreadsheeting, external trade tools. For a lot of players, learning Path of Exile basically meant opening 10 other browser tabs. But now Path of Exile 2 is introducing an integrated build guide system where you can import creator builds directly into the game itself. And that's a massive shift for the game, because this isn't just quality of life, it's onboarding experience for new players and returning players and players that are playing this game already. It's Grindinggeargames trying to reduce the gap between wanting to play Path of Exile and actually understanding how to play Path of Exile. And honestly, I think this might end up being one of the most long-term changes in the entire update, because accessibility in ARPGs usually gets misunderstood. People often assume accessibility means making the game easier, but that's not really what this is doing. It's making systems easier to understand without necessarily removing the complexity itself. And those are two very different things. On another note, there's also a new League mechanic called Runes of Aldura that I briefly touched upon earlier. And very predictably for Grindinggeargames, it's both powerful and slightly absurd. What I mean by this is that the league itself revolves around rune smithing and crafting new runes combinations, including some with intentionally dangerous effects, like summoning skeletons that can literally attack you if used incorrectly, which honestly feels very on brand for Path of Exiles. And the game has always had this strange mix of incredibly deep systems and developers that clearly enjoy trolling their own player base just a little bit. Patch 0.5 introduces 2 new Ascendancies as well. There's the Spirit Walker and the Martial Artist, not entirely new base classes, which some players might have hoped for, but still meaningful additions that expand the build diversity just a bit. Alongside that, there's also more uniques. There's improved unique progression systems. There's new defensive resource called Ward that you can get through the league and the rune smithing part, and generally a much larger focus on making Endgame feel less frustrating and more rewarding. And when you look at these changes altogether, a pattern starts to emerge. This patch isn't just trying to reinvent Path of Exile 2, it's trying to make the game feel more coherent, more connected in a way. Like the campaign, the progression systems, the atlas, bosses, and crafting mechanics all belong to the same experience instead of feeling segmented. And that's also why people are paying so much attention to this update specifically, because many players see this patch 0.5 as a make or break moment before 1.0 launches later this year, that they confirmed in their whole reveal of the Return of the Ancients 0.5 patch. But not because Path of Exile 2 is failing, but because this is the point where the game's structure needs to prove itself. Now, as for 1.0 itself, Grindinggeargames is currently targeting 2026, most likely shortly after ExileCon in November. That will be the full launch of the game, no longer early access, completely free to play, and importantly, it'll finally complete the campaign with Act 5 and 6. More classes and additional content are also expected either at launch or shortly afterward. But what's interesting is that Grindinggeargames doesn't seem overly interested in rushing it. They've openly stated that they want the game to launch as a proper banger, and that they're willing to delay things slightly if feedback on the endgame suggests more work is needed. And honestly, that's probably the correct approach, because Path of Exile is one of those games where endgame isn't just extra content, it is the game. And that's why the sentiment around 0.5 has been so positive overall. A lot of players are already calling it the version PoE 2 should have launched with. Players are excited about the endgame overhaul, the new quest lines, the better crafting systems, and especially the integrated build tools. But at the same time, there are still some concerns. Some people expected a new class like the Duelist and were disappointed to not see one. Others feel the gap between patch 0.4 and 0.5 were simply too long, and there's still uncertainty about whether the endgame now feels truly complete enough for a 1.0 release. But overall, patch 0.5 feels less like a seasonal update and more like Grindinggeargames laying the foundations for what Path of Exile 2 is actually supposed to become. Because right now, the game itself already has the combat, it already has the atmosphere, it already has the depth. The real question has been whether all those systems can actually come together into something cohesive long term. And Return of the Ancients looks like the first time PoE 2 is seriously trying to answer that question. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Grindinggeargames does for Path of Exile 2, especially leading up to its full release, but also during this very long period in between 0.5 patch and the full launch, because there's a half-year gap between these two, and they have, for that matter, stated that the new league will last for the whole period. So I'm hoping to see some, if not smaller updates or small patches that could add some hopefully meaningful content in between, because otherwise it's going to be a very dry gap between the launch of the 0.5 and the full game. That's going to do it for me. Take care, everyone.